The rain on Varth IV did not fall like rain on earth. It came sideways, thick and warm, smelling of sulfur and wet stone. It soaked through everything. It made the red cross on the medical tent looked like it was bleeding. Suna Orel did not mind the rain. She had been working for 19 hours straight, and the cold of it kept her awake. She moved between the CS with steady hands, checking pressure bandages, adjusting oxygen lines, speaking quietly to the ones who were scared. Most of them were scared. Wounded soldiers always were, no matter which species they belonged to. The Durath soldier in Cot 7 had been brought in 4 hours ago. His leg was gone below the knee, and his chest had taken shrapnel from his own side's misfire. He was heavy, dense boned with a gray-green hide that had gone pale from blood loss. His kind had been fighting human peacekeeping forces along the Varth border for 3 months. He had probably fired at humans himself before the shell took his leg. Suna cleaned his wound the same way she cleaned every wound. Delegate Fan stood near the tent entrance watching her work. The Vi were a quiet people, long-limbed and careful with their words. Fan had been the local liaison for 2 years, and he had learned that Suna was the kind of human who made even enemies feel safe. He considered that a remarkable thing. Commander Rael Dorn was outside walking the perimeter. He had done 3 full perimeter walks since nightfall. The intelligence reports from the past week had been bad. Durath forward units moving closer to the neutral zone. Communications going quiet in ways that meant something was being planned. He had reported it up the chain. He had been told to hold position and trust the accord. He was on his second cigarette when he heard the first engine. It was not a transport sound. It was not a patrol drone. It was the low-spreading growl of strike craft dropping from altitude, and by the time his brain finished identifying it, his body was already moving. He shouted the alarm. The camp response was fast. These were trained people, but fast was not fast enough for what came next. The first strike hit the supply depot 40 m north of the medical tent. The second hit the communications tower. The third, fourth, and fifth hit the medical tent itself in a line like someone had drawn a finger across a map and said their rail was thrown by the pressure wave. He hit the ground hard, tasted blood, got up. Medical tent was gone. Where it had been there was fire and collapsed framework and the smell of burning that he would never be able to describe to anyone who had not smelled it. He ran toward it anyway. They pulled 7 people out alive. Suna was not one of them. They found her near Cot 7. She had put herself over the Durath soldier when the roof came down. The soldier survived. He was unconscious and would not know for several days what she had done. Fan sat in the mud with his long hands over his face. Rael Dorn stood in the rain and looked at what remained of the tent and said nothing for a long time. Then he walked to the emergency communications unit, the backup, the one buried in a casing 2 FT underground for exactly this kind of moment, and he opened a channel to Earth Command. He did not file a report. He did not use formal language. He said they hit the hospital. The neutral flag was up. The lights were on. The markings were visible from orbit. Suna is gone. The wounded were inside. I need you to understand what I am telling you. They knew what it was. They hit it anyway. He closed the channel. Around him the survivors were doing what survivors do. Moving, helping, not stopping, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and there was no time for that yet. A young medic named Oris was treating a burn patient with shaking hands and doing it correctly. A very ground worker was pulling cable away from a fire with no protective gloves and not stopping when his hands blistered. The Durath strike craft were gone. They had come in fast, done what they came to do, and left. No warning, no targeting error. The neutral markings on the medical tent were regulation size, regulation color visible on any standard sensor array from 40 km up. This was not a mistake. Rail knew it, Fan knew it. Everyone still breathing in that camp knew it. What none of them knew yet was what the knowing would cost. The rain kept coming down sideways, warm and sulfur thick. The red cross on the one tent panel still standing had soaked through completely now. It was not legible anymore, just a dark shape in the dark. Somewhere in the wreckage, a medical monitor was still running, still beeping, connected to nothing. Rail Dorn sat down on a broken supply crate, put his elbows on his knees, and waited for Earth to call back. He did not wait long. The footage arrived at Earth Command at 340 hours, routed through 3 relay stations and flagged Priority 1 by an automated system that recognized the word hospital in a combat transmission. By 400 hours, Admiral Yevastra was sitting in a dark screening room watching it alone. She watched it 4 times. The first time she was looking for sensor data, approach vectors, craft signatures, altitude, engagement. The second time she was looking at the markings on the tent. The third time she watched the moment of impact and did not look away. The fourth time she watched Rail Dorn's face in the emergency transmission, and she watched it until the recording ended and the screen went dark and she was sitting in silence. She sat there for a while. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked out to begin the worst day the Durath had ever caused themselves. By 600 hours, the Durath ambassador had already delivered a statement. His name was Gree, and he was smooth in the way that certain diplomats are smooth. Practiced, surface perfect, nothing underneath. He stood in the council anti-room in front of 6 cameras and said that the strike had been the result of faulty sensor data, that the installation had been flagged in Durath intelligence as a weapons cache operating under false neutral markings, and that the Dura Combine deeply regretted any loss of life resulting from this misidentification. He said misidentification, the way someone says a word they have rehearsed. The reporters asked follow-up questions. Gree answered 3 of them and then said the matter was under internal review and he had nothing further to add. Galactic Council emergency session opened at 900 hours. The chamber held 41 species representatives, and the noise of all of them arriving and taking their seats was the noise of controlled alarm. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone had seen the footage, and everyone had already decided what they were going to say before they sat down. The KE representative spoke first. He said this was a tragedy, and that tragedy required careful response, that escalation served no one, that a joint investigative committee should be formed to establish facts before any action was taken. The Solvari delegate agreed. She said humanity had suffered a terrible loss and that the Accord had mechanisms for exactly this kind of situation, and that those mechanisms should be trusted. 4 more representatives spoke in similar terms: patient, measured, calm. Words arranged to mean very little, sounding like they meant something. Admiral Strauss sat at the human delegation table and listened to all of it. She had a glass of water in front of her that she did not touch. Her aide, a young man named Tev, sat beside her and said nothing because he had worked with her long enough to know when she had already decided something. When the floor was given to the human delegation, Strauss stood. She did not use notes. She looked around the chamber once slowly, and then she spoke. She said the Durath had struck a medical installation, operating under full neutral markings, visible on standard sensors from low orbit. She said a human medic had died while actively treating a wounded Durath soldier. She said humanity had proposed binding medical neutrality enforcement clauses to this council 31 years ago and had been voted down in favor of language that was, in her word, decorative. She said, we will respond to this. That is not a negotiation point. That is not a discussion item. I'm not asking for your support or your committee. I am informing this body as a courtesy that humanity will respond. She picked up her folder, pushed in her chair and walked out. The chamber erupted, 40 species talking at once in 40 languages. The KE representative was on his feet. The Svari delegate was calling for a procedural hold. 3 different representatives were trying to reach the human delegation table and, finding it empty, Tev had to walk quickly to keep up with Strauss in the corridor. He asked her what they were going to do. She said they were going to do what they should have done the last 3 times. An Accord member struck a neutral medical site and the council formed a committee. He asked her what that was. She said something that doesn't form a committee on Earth. The mobilization order had already gone out before Strauss left the council building. It had gone out the moment the screening room door closed behind her at 400 hours because she had made the call before she watched the footage a second time. The first viewing had been enough. Across 17 human worlds and 42 human installations, reserve fleet crews were being pulled from sleep rotations. Fueled ships were being moved from dry dock, and supply chains were spinning up in ways they had not spun up in 30 years. Nobody panicked. That was the thing that would confuse the rest of the galaxy. Later, when they looked back at this moment, there was no panic. There was no noise. There was just humans moving with purpose in the same direction, very fast and very quiet. The Durath sensor operator on board the border station, Kevat, was the first non-human to see the fleet. His name was Das, and he was 3 hours into a routine watch when his board lit up in ways it was not designed to handle. The proximity alert system, built to flag groups of up to 40 vessels, simply stopped working. It had no category for what it was seeing. Das stared at his display for a full 10 seconds. Then he called his supervisor. His supervisor called the station commander. The station commander called the Durath home fleet, and for the first time in the 40-year history of that border station, everyone who received the call went quiet before they responded. The human fleet had come out of FTL in a spread formation that covered an area of space normally reserved for debris, fields, and dead stars. It was not a wall. It was not a column. It was a presence, the way a weather system is a presence filling the horizon in every direction at once. There were more ships than the Durath had been told humanity possessed. There were more ships than any intelligence report had ever suggested. Later, a Durath analyst would spend 6 months trying to reconcile the numbers with everything the Combine had believed about human military capacity, and she would eventually conclude that humanity had simply never shown anyone everything. They had spent 40 years attending council meetings and proposing clauses and accepting committee reports. And the whole time, somewhere behind all of that, they had been building. Commander Rael Dorn received his field command orders on Var IV, where he had spent the past 4 days helping reconstruct the destroyed camp and arranging the transfer of the Durath prisoner, the one Suna had died covering, to a proper medical facility. The prisoner had been told what happened. He had not spoken since. Rael read the orders twice, folded the paper. He still used paper for things that mattered, and told his second, a woman named Finn, to have the ground teams ready in 6 hours. Finn asked him how he was. He said he was ready. She knew him well enough to accept that as a complete answer. The fleet's first action was not a strike. It was a broadcast. Every Durath installation within 4 light towers received the same transmission in Dura Militariband frequency, translated into 3 Durath dialects by human linguists who had been preparing the text for 2 days. The message was short. It named the hospital, it named the date, it named the officers of the strike unit. It said those officers were to be surrendered to human custody within 72 hours, or the fleet would begin engagement of all Durath military assets in the border region. It did not say, please. It did not say, we hope. It said, will. The Galactic Council's emergency envoy reached the human flagship 6 hours after the broadcast. There were 3 of them, a KET diplomat, a Svari legal officer, and a representative from a small species called the Vin, who had been chosen because they had no history with either humanity or the Durath and were considered neutral. Admiral Straw met them in the flagship's forward conference room. She offered them water. She listened to everything they said. The KE diplomats spoke for most of it. Measured language about proportionality, about the risk of broader conflict, about the importance of the Accord's judicial processes. When he finished, Strauss said the Accord's judicial processes produced 31 years of decorative language and a committee report on the medical strike that no one acted on. I read that report. It used the word concerning 4 times. The Solvari officer said that the current action risked destabilizing the entire border region and affecting species who had no part in the hospital strike. Straw said, you had a century to build a rule that meant something. You didn't. The Durath knew the tent was a hospital and they struck it. My medic died covering a Durath soldier she was trying to save. I have been patient with this body for a long time. Step aside. The Vin representative, who had not spoken at all, looked at Straw for a long moment and then stood and walked to the door. The other 2 followed. None of them tried again after that. Rail's ground teams made their first contact with Durath border troops 6 hours later. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. Human forces moved to the Durath position, established a perimeter, and broadcast the surrender demand at close range. The Durath troops were not the strike unit. They were border garrison soldiers who had nothing to do with the hospital. Rael gave them 4 hours. Then he gave them 1 more. Most of them Surrendered, the ones who didn't were dealt with quickly, and their wounded were taken to the human field station. Set up 400 back, where medics in full neutral markings treated them with the same care they treated anyone. Galaxy was watching. Rail had made sure of that. Every medic wore a camera. Every treatment was recorded. He was making a point before the real fight even started. The Durath War Council met for 11 hours before they gave the order to fire. There were voices against it. Junior Admiral named Varuk sat at the far end of the table and said 3 separate times that engaging the human fleet at this scale was a decision they could not take back. He said the numbers did not work. He said the fleet sitting outside their border was not a bluff in, was not the entirety of what humanity could deploy, and that if they fired first, they would not be defending themselves, they would be giving humanity a reason to stop being careful. The council overruled him. The senior war minister said that showing restraint in the face of an ultimatum was surrender, and that the Durath Combine did not surrender. Varuk said nothing after that. He sat and watched them make the decision, and he memorized every face at the table. The Durath opened fire at 1100 hours with a coordinated strike from 3 defensive platforms and 2 cruiser groups positioned along the border. It was a serious attack against most fleets. It would have been a meaningful opening blow against the human fleet. It created a brief light show and a lot of noise on sensor arrays. The human fleet absorbed the strike across its forward edge and returned fire with a precision that the Durath sensor team struggled to process in real time. Human targeting was not aimed at maximum damage. It was aimed at maximum specificity. Weapons, platforms, propulsion systems, command arrays, ships were disabled rather than destroyed where possible. The Durath cruisers that took the first wave of return fire lost engines and weapons the same 10-second window, and then sat in space intact, unable to move or shoot, while the humans moved past them. It was the most unsettling thing the Durath sensor teams had ever recorded. An enemy that could kill you, choosing very deliberately not to. That was a different kind of threat than one that simply tried to destroy everything on the ground. Rail moved his forces forward in coordinated pushes through 4 Durath border installations. The ground war did not look like the space engagement. It was close, loud, and hard. Durath ground troops were disciplined fighters, and they knew their terrain. Human forces took casualties. Fen was hit in the second hour of the second push. Shrapnel through her left arm, and she kept commanding from a field position for 2 more hours until Rail physically ordered her to the medical station. The medical station was the thing the Durath ground commanders noticed first and could not explain. It was set up 400 behind the front line, same as always, full neutral markings, same as always, human medics moving between CS, same as always, but the CS held Durath soldiers, wounded Durath fighters who had been pulled from the field by human forces, were being carried to the human station and treated, not held, not interrogated. Treated, wounds cleaned, blood replaced, pain managed. One Durath corporal, a fighter who had been shooting at human forces 20 minutes before, woke up on a cot to find a human medic adjusting the bandage on his chest. He grabbed the medic's wrist. Medic looked at him and said in careful, "Durath, you are safe here." Corporal let go. He did not know what to do with that information. None of the Durath soldiers in that station did. They had been trained to expect one thing from an enemy and were receiving something else entirely, and the gap between the two things was large enough to cause a kind of quiet shock. Every medic in that station wore a camera. Every treatment was being transmitted live to a relay that fed the galactic council chambers, alien news networks, and every species that had a receiver pointed at very space. The footage spread faster than the battle reports. The KE delegation watched it in session. Without comment, the Silvari legal officer requested a copy for documentation. A Ven News aggregator ran the field station footage alongside the hospital strike footage on a split feed. And something in the contrast of those two images, the before and the after, the attacked hospital and the treating station, communicated to the watching galaxy something that no speech had managed to land. Humanity was not doing this out of rage. Rage did not treat enemy wounded. Rage did not set up a clearly marked medical station in the middle of a fight it was winning. Whatever this was, it was something colder and more deliberate than rage. Rail received a field report at 1800 hours that the last Durath defensive platform in the border region had gone offline. The space engagement was effectively over. He acknowledged the report, checked on Finn in the medical station, and then walked to the edge of the field and stood in the quiet for a while. He thought about Suna. He thought about her hands, how steady they always were. He thought about the Durath soldier she had covered with her body, who had now been moved to a proper facility and was recovering and still had not spoken. He wondered if that soldier knew yet that the humans who had treated him in the field were treating Durath soldiers right now in a tent 400 back. He thought Suna would have found that important. He thought she would have been right. The War Council met again, but this time the room was smaller. 3 of the senior ministers had not come back from the border installations, not killed, captured, sitting in human field custody, being fed and given water and treated with a correctness that somehow made the situation more humiliating than a cell would have. The remaining ministers looked at the battle map for a long time. The border region was gone. 17 installations, 4 cruiser groups, and 2 defensive platforms disabled, occupied or surrendered. The human fleet sat in Durath border space the way a mountain sits in a valley. It was not going anywhere. One minister suggested a third party ceasefire. Another suggested a direct approach to the council. The war minister, who had overruled Varrock, said nothing this time. He was looking at the map and doing mathematics that were not coming out in his favor. Varrock was not in the room. He had left the War Council chamber 8 hours earlier, and no one had found him yet, which meant he had gone somewhere deliberately and was doing something the council had not authorized. He was in fact sitting in a communications room on a lower level of the command installation, composing a message to Commander Rail Dorn. It took him 40 minutes to write. He was not a diplomat and had no practice in this kind of communication. He deleted it twice and started again. What he was trying to say was simple, but the simplicity of it was also the hard part. He had opposed the hospital strike from the beginning. He had been overruled. He understood now that the council would not surrender the officers voluntarily. and that the people making that decision were not the ones who would pay for it. That was not a situation he was willing to continue participating in. He sent the message and then sat and waited. Rael received it 40 minutes later. He read it 3 times, handed it to Finn. Her arm in a brace, her expression as flat as it always was, and asked what she thought. Finn said it was either real or the best trap she had ever seen, and that she did not think the Durath had the kind of strategic patience required to construct it. Rael sent a reply. He said, "If you are serious, I will meet you. I will come with 2 people. You come with 2 people. We pick a neutral point and we talk. If this is something else, you won't get a second chance." Varric responded in 11 minutes. He gave coordinates. He said, "I will be there." The meeting happened in a decommissioned very trading post 18 km from the nearest active military position, which meant both parties had to travel through territory that was technically still contested. Rael brought Finn and a linguist named Sauls. Var came with a junior officer and no weapons, which Rael respected. They sat across a table that had not been used in years in a room that smelled of dust and old metal. Varric said in careful standard, "The officers who ordered the strike on the hospital are Durath citizens, and under Durath authority, I cannot hand them to you as myself. I can only hand them to you as someone with authority to do so. I do not currently have that authority." Rael said, "What would it take for you to have it?" Varric said, "A formal removal of the sitting war council, ratified by the military high command. Under emergency provision, I have the votes. I have had the votes for 2 days. I did not move earlier because I was not certain you would accept a transfer from a new council as satisfying your terms." Rael looked at him for a moment, then he said, "If you remove the council and deliver the officers to a joint tribunal, not just human joint, I recommend to Admiral Straw that the fleet holds its position pending the process." Varric said, "I need 72 hours. Rael said, "You have 48. It moved faster than 48 hours. Varric was efficient in a way the sitting council had never been, possibly because he had been planning it longer than anyone knew. The emergency provision was invoked at 600 the following morning. The War Council was relieved of authority by a military high command vote that was not close. By evening, the officers responsible for the hospital strike were in transport to the joint custody point Rael and Var had agreed on in the trading post. Rael sent the update to Earth Command and then sent a second shorter message that was not part of any official report. It said, "Soon as work is done." Admiral Straw read it in her office and sat quietly for a while. In the council chambers, the shift in the room was something every representative felt, but none of them described the same way. Afterward, the Keth delegate said it felt like pressure releasing. The Svari officer said it felt like something being corrected. The Vin representative, who had watched everything from the beginning and said very little, said it felt like a lesson. Someone tabled the motion for binding medical neutrality enforcement before the session was even formally opened. It was not the human delegation, it was the KE. Nobody spoke against it in the first session. That had never happened before. Humanity had proposed the same clause 31 years ago. Back then it had taken 6 sessions and still failed. Nobody in the chamber needed that fact explained to them. They were all thinking it simultaneously in 40 different languages, arriving at the same conclusion. It should not have taken this. The tribunal took 11 days. It was held on a station in neutral space constructed specifically for the purpose out of prefabricated units that smelled of fresh sealant and had no history. The panel was 7 members, 2 human, 2 Durath, 1K, 1 Safari, 1 Vin. The selection had taken longer than the construction. Varric testified for 4 hours on the second day. He spoke about the war council meeting where the hospital strike had been approved. He named every person who had voted for it. He described the conversation in precise detail, including the moment when he had said for the 3rd time that this was a decision they could not take back, and the war minister had told him that restraint was surrender. He said, "I left the chamber that day, believing I had failed. I did not yet know what I had failed to prevent." Accused officers did not speak in their own defense. Their legal representative argued misidentification. The tribunal reviewed the sensor logs, the approach vectors, the targeting data, and the neutral markings visible on every frequency the strike craft used. For navigation, the misidentification argument required believing that a set of instruments was simultaneously wrong across every frequency in the same way. At the same time, the tribunal did not find this persuasive. The verdicts came on day 11. Convictions covered the ordering officers and the strike unit command. The sentences were long and would be served in a facility that was not Durath, not human, but jointly administered, another thing that had not existed before this. Rael was not at the tribunal. He had been on Varth IV since the fleet stood down, and he was there when the verdicts came through on a handheld that Finn handed him without comment. He read the summary, handed it back, and kept working. They were rebuilding the camp, not the medical tent specifically. There was going to be a permanent structure there now, funded by 3 different governments, designed by a VI architect who had worked on the original Accord buildings. Rael was not a builder, but he was good at moving materials and following directions, and the Versi ground crew seemed to find his presence useful rather than strange. The camp's oldest Versi worker, a woman named Hella, who had been at the site since before the Accord, told Rael one afternoon that the verse word for a place where healing happened was the same word they used for a place that had been broken and repaired. She said in their language there was no meaningful difference between the 2 concepts, because a thing could not become a place of healing without first being a place of harm. Rael thought about that for a long time. Admiral Straw returned to Earth for her debrief 3 weeks after the tribunal closed. She answered every question the Oversight Committee asked her. When they asked if she would have done anything differently, she said no, and explained why in the same flat, precise language she used for everything. When they asked if she thought the outcome justified the method, she said that was not the right question. They asked her what the right question was. She said the right question is why the method was necessary. 31 years of proposals and votes and committee reports produced nothing that stopped a hospital from being bombed. 1 fleet deployment produced a binding clause that passed without opposition. Ask yourselves why those 2 things are true, and then decide what kind of institution you want to be a part of going forward. The committee did not have a good Answer: she did not expect one. The Orel clause passed the Galactic Council on a Tuesday, which meant nothing ceremonially, but had a neat quality to it that the VIN representative later mentioned in an interview. It passed unanimously. Every species in the Accord ratified it within the following month, which was also a first. The clause bound every Accord member to treat medical installations as inviolable under all circumstances, to defend that inviolability through force if necessary, and to pursue legal accountability without exception when violations occurred. It was named for Suna Orel. Delegate Fan attended the naming ceremony and said nothing during the reception after, but he stayed until the last guest left and then sat alone in the chamber for a while. Rael found the letter in his personal effects 2 months after returning to Varth IV. He did not know she had written it. It was in a sealed envelope with his name on it, dated 4 days before the hospital strike. She had been meaning to give it to him, and had kept not finding the right moment. He read it once sitting outside the construction site in the evening, with the sulfur smell of Var somewhere in the distance. She had written about why she became a medic. She wrote that she had decided early that the most direct way to reject the logic of war was to treat the wounded it created, regardless of which side they came from. She wrote that she thought this was the one thing that could not be argued with. Not politics, not species, not history. A wounded person was just a wounded person. Treating them was just the right thing. The letter ended: if we stop treating the wounded, even theirs, then we stop being worth saving ourselves. Rael folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. The construction crew was still working. Behind him, Versi voices talking in their quiet, careful way.